6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, it looks like everyone is here. Before we start the meeting, I'd like to go over the ground rules. This will be a completely virtual meeting using the Zoom webinar platform. The platform has a capacity of 100 attendees. It looks like we're well below that now. Public participants will be muted except during the public comment portion of the meeting, where individuals wishing to comment will be unmuted individually. Members of the public can indicate their desire to provide comment either by submitting a request in advance or by using the raise hand feature of the Zoom webinar at the end of the public comment section. Members of the public are asked to state their full name and address at the start of their comments. For the meeting, a roll call will be taken at the start of the meeting to confirm all board members can hear the proceedings and be heard, and roll call votes will be taken for all motions at the meeting. Board members should use their raise hand feature to indicate they would like to have the floor and should state their name before proposing or seconding a motion. As with our in-person meetings, this board meeting is being recorded and will be made available on the district website. One other comment, I ask that everyone remain standing after the Pledge of Allegiance for a moment of silence in memory of East Penn student Key DeSazer, who passed away on Sunday, April 19th. With that, I'll now call the April 27th meeting of the East Penn Board of School Directors to order. Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, the first order of business is the roll call. Mrs. Allen, will you call the roll?
Bowman. Ms. Bowman.
Present.
Thank you. Mr. Byrd.
Present.
Mr. Champagne.
Present.
Mr. Jankowski. I see he's present, but his phone is not responding. Dr. Levinson.
Here.
Dr. Munson. Dr. Munson.
Present.
Thank you. Mr. Smith.
Present.
Ms. Lynch.
Present.
Dr. Bacher.
Present. Mr. Jankowski, can you just unmute and say present? I didn't hear you. We can't hear your audio. Oh, you're not, yeah.
No, now can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. Great.
Okay,
Thank you.
present.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, our first order of business is suspension of requirements of board policy 006.1. May I have a motion?
So moved.
Josh,
This is Alyssa.
second.
That was Alyssa Bowman.
Yep.
With the motion. Okay. Is there any discussion?
Can I just ask who seconded that?
Excuse me?
Who seconded that motion?
I did, Janine. Josh Levinson.
Thank you. Can you do
Welcome.
me a favor when you make the motion, just say your name beforehand whenever you do the motion or make a comment? Thank you.
Mrs. Allen, will you call the roll, please?
Mr. Byrd.
Yes.
Mr. Champagne,
Aye.
Mr. Jankowski, Mr. Jankowski,
Aye.
Dr. Levinson,
Aye.
Dr. Munson,
Aye.
Mr. Smith,
Aye.
Ms. Lynch,
Aye.
Ms. Bowman,
Aye.
Dr. Bacher.
Aye.
9 ayes.
Motion passes. Moving on to requests to address the board. I understand we had two requests in advance. The first is Mary Ann Miller on the subject of ethics. Can you unmute? Is Ms. Miller unmuted?
I don't believe she's on here any longer.
Okay, then we'll move on to the second request, Mrs. Betsy Champagne on the budget.
Ms. Champagne should be unmuted at this point.
So her icon shows muted on my screen. I don't know about others.
It says talking permitted, but muted.
Ms. Champagne, are you able to unmute yourself? I don't have the ability to unmute you.
It might be an ability for her to go right in the chat. There, oh, maybe not have way.
Yeah, I see her video, but not,
I go downstairs and figure out what's going on.
I moved her to a panelist, so at this point she should be able to speak. And I have attempted to unmute her video, and I believe it's on her end that she needs to unmute.
Okay. I guess we have to continue. I don't, oh,
Hold on.
Yeah.
Let me see. No, I wanted to see if I could do something here. No, it doesn't allow me either.
okay, I think we'll have to continue. I don't see any other attendees raising their hand either for public comment. So I think we'll have to continue to the next session, the next item on the agenda, which is approval of minutes. May I have a motion?
Old Champagne.
Second, Elisa Bowman.
Is there any discussion? Mrs. Allen, will you call the roll, please?
Mr. Champagne,
Aye.
Mr. Jankowski,
Aye.
Dr. Levinson,
Aye.
Dr. Munson,
Aye.
Mr. Smith,
Aye.
Ms. Lynch,
Aye.
Ms. Bowman,
Aye.
Mr. Byrd,
Aye.
Dr. Bacher.
Aye.
9 ayes.
Motion passes. Moving on to a presentation on proposed final budget update.
Thank you. In just a moment, Mr. Saul will share with the board and the public our proposed final budget for 2020-21. But I wanted to first begin by reminding the board and the public that our presentations began exactly 3 months ago on January 27th. And at that time, we outlined our budgetary goals that would guide our decision-making process regarding our financial priorities for the upcoming school year. Over the past 3 months, we've provided the board and the public with a total of 4 presentations regarding our projected revenues, our anticipated expenditures, our capital projects and long-range plan, and then in addition, our district priorities in terms of new programs and staffing that we were recommending. As I think you can all appreciate, the financial landscape of East Penn, as well as for all districts across the Commonwealth, has changed significantly since we first began that budget development process. And today, there are several financial challenges that we face that simply just didn't exist about 6 weeks ago. While we recognize that addressing new programs and staff may not be feasible at this time, we continue to remain committed to offering high-quality educational experiences to all of our students in East Penn, while certainly being very sensitive to the short and long-term financial health of our organization. And so at this point, I am going to turn the presentation over to Mr. Saul, who will review with the board this evening the proposed final budget.
First, like to start reviewing something that the board asked us to look into and bring back, and that is a proposal for revision to the property tax rebate program. There was a proposal document distributed to the board back in December 9th. The board approved a resolution that requested the administration to include an expansion of the income eligibility guidelines for in the budget for the 20 year. And while we were looking at the program and particularly the expansion, we wanted to take a holistic look at the program, not just expansion, but any revisions that we're fortunate that through the aid of the Pennsylvania Association of School Business Officials, PASBO, we were actually able to identify with the Pennsylvania Department of Revenue, who served as a conduit to help as it compares to the state program and the data that the state has at the state level. In addition, we reviewed the similar programs in other school districts just to see how those programs operated in relation to our own program. I wanted to just highlight a few of the details of the plan that we've set forth. First, the data, the most recent data that was available from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania was 2017, and so that's if you see that that data was from 2017 and wonder why it may be a few years old, it was the most recent that we could secure that the Commonwealth would be willing to release. The program that is set forth in the document has expanded income ranges, and they have also been realigned to align with the Commonwealth program so that the cut points in the ranges are similar to the Commonwealth program. And that was for two reasons. One was to simplify completing the application. We've heard from time to time from individuals who complete the application two things. One, please simplify it if you have the opportunity, and two, make it consistent with the state program so that while we're completing these, the process is as simple as possible. In doing that, there was actually one area I do want to point out and that was the income range of $8,000 to $10,000. East Penn School District was actually paying more than the state program. And in revising the what I'll call the cut points on the income ranges, a person in the income range of $8,000 to $10,000 would actually have a reduction in the rebate based on what we've set forth. The program does expand. The proposal we have set forth here does expand the maximum household income from $20,000 to $25,000. So that's the expansion that was requested by the board. In addition, I wanted to point out that the Commonwealth program actually does go up to $35,000. It's just looking at that and the cost of implementing a plan in East Penn that would go up to that level in 1 year seemed, somewhat cost prohibitive. East Penn's program had a percentage factor. Actually, we presently have a percentage factor, which is a limiting factor that will reduce an individual's refund. And when we went back and looked at the history, we noticed that there was a very small percentage, like 1% of the applications were actually affected by that. But it was a complicating factor in completing the application. So when we evaluated the its effectiveness compared to the complications that it was creating, we felt it would be reasonable to suggest removing that factor. When we looked at participation, simply based on the number of participants, we saw that participation was roughly 49%. We feel that we could have a 15% increase in participation. And a question was submitted previously saying, how did we come up with that estimate of 15%? And I will classify that as an unsophisticated estimate. It was really just an estimate, if you will. So that would increase our participation to about 64%. There was a typo with regard to rounding in the document. I do apologize for that. So looking at the plan, we would potentially increase by about 233 participants to a total of 501 participants with the plan that's set forth. And then finally, the cost to implement this plan would be around $74,000. And just for the board's benefit, because it's a rebate program, the rebates are netted off of the real estate tax that we receive. So you don't actually see an expenditure line item. This comes through as a reduction in the revenue line item. And you actually see it then, and if you take that a step further, it's part of that collectible percentage. It actually would reduce our percentage collection on our real estate taxes. So again, the district's recommendation in terms of what a revised program would look like is set forth in the document. But I do have to say that while this is our recommendation based on the board's request for an expanded program, given the budgetary challenges for 2021, we're really torn about the implementation of this plan because with the budgetary challenges we'll have, the monies that would expand this program are likely going to come at the cost of our educational program. So I did feel it was important to say that. Again, we're torn. We certainly recognize the benefits to both, funding for our educational program and funding for those who may be in need. And then, I guess if you have the benefit of having the plan in front of you, on page 9 is the recommendation, at least with regard to the plan. So I wanted to stop here before we proceed to the budget and see if there are any questions from the board, specifically with regard to what has been put together at the board's request.
Dr. Levinson?
Mr. Saul, thank you very much, and I appreciate the follow-up on some of the comments that I did submit from last week. I first want to, express my gratitude for the administration taking a very serious look at what an expanded program would look like, coming up with a very solid proposal in terms of something that could have a significant impact on our low-income taxpayers, but at the same time, be incremental in terms of where we think it could be beyond what we're already extending for our current program. So again, I'm very grateful to the amount of effort that was done here, the systematic analysis, and what you presented was actually, in line with how I probably would have approached it myself in terms of getting the data and trying to get various income levels and seeing where the total cost would go. I do, again, as far as evaluating the expansion itself, I think that the convenience and simplicity that's afforded by realigning the plan to the Pennsylvania guidelines is attractive. It's nice to see that there's a little bit of a boost in the 15 to 18K range, in addition to pulling in additional benefit in the 20 to 25K range of property tax payers. The one aspect that I did take note of, and you already did mention it, is that the realignment of the district's plan to the PA plan does reduce the benefit of taxpayers that are in the 8 to 10K range. When I first talked about this back in December, I was hesitant to do anything that would remove something that people were already getting. So in terms of where we are in considering an expanded PTR program, I would like to make a strong recommendation that we don't retreat out of that particular range and keep it there, so that again we can maintain that benefit for the taxpayers that fall in that range. And just a back of the envelope calculation, again using the assumptions and the analysis that was provided from 2017. It looks like from the PA data, there were 72 people who are falling in that income range from 8 to 10,000. And if we were to look at the 64% participation rate, the incremental cost to providing them the full $650 benefit from the $500 benefit is just below $7,000. So if we add that to the 74,000 you said is what the additional cost would be for implementing this plan over what we're already offering, that would now become $81,000. Now, I do fully appreciate the comment that you made that, and again, we're probably going to get into a lot of this sentiment in a moment when we talk about the budget itself. These are difficult times, and we are looking for ways to preserve our position in terms of of what we offer to students. Again, at the same time, these are challenging times, and there are taxpayers out there who could certainly use as much a break as we possibly can afford to give them. So I'd just like to sum up by saying that, again, I'm very grateful to the administration taking a serious look at this and providing a proposal for the board to consider that is both helpful to taxpayer and also incremental, so that it's something that the district can handle. And I would like to make the recommendation that we not necessarily retreat from that 8 to 10,000 range and keep that at 650, which is our current benefit from the plan. And I'd welcome comment from both the administration and my fellow members of the board on that vein. Again, thank you very much.
Dr. Munson, I don't know if your question was answered, but you had your hand up earlier.
Yes. So my question was answered, but I'll respond to the query that Dr. Levinson had. My understanding of the change, and Mr. Saul, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of the change for that particular income group was to align it with what the state is doing for the purpose of making the whole thing more easier to use and easier to apply to. So while I am, I guess I'm largely in agreement with Dr. Levinson, I would also say that there is a real advantage to taxpayers to having a far simpler form. If this means that we can have greater participation overall, I actually think that that is an advantage. So I'll leave it at that.
Are there any other comments on this part of the proposal? I would like to, I guess, echo Dr. Munson's comments. I am concerned about going backwards on some income groups, but I think not only the alignment to the Pennsylvania income levels, but also the reduction of the extra, was it an income percentage of some sort that simplifies the form is advantageous and likely to increase usage. I'm actually concerned in tight times that we might see more of a increase in usage if it's better aligned to Pennsylvania and simpler. It doesn't have added requirements. And so I am concerned, in line with the comments you brought up, Mr. Saul, that we keep open how much we're expanding the eligibility limits as we progress in the budget cycle, because it could be more than the estimated increase. And as you said, there might be programmatic impacts as a result of that. So I would like to keep that in mind. As with the district's budget, the school board did approve this in different times. And so I think this has to be part of the discussion going forward. How much do we expand this program in these times? Does anyone else want to, Mr. Champagne?
Yeah, I was gonna, thank you, Ken. I was gonna say many of the same things that you just mentioned, that I did some back of the envelope math, and if we actually had 100% participation based on the 2017 numbers, that would add another roughly $180,000 of cost, if I did the math correctly, to the program. And while I can understand the need to help low-income taxpayers, times have changed. Everything has changed in terms of financial implications for the district. And so I would like to make sure that as we go through the budget, as you mentioned, that we keep this program in mind and decide at the time that we are really buttoning down the budget, whether we can afford to make the changes that have been laid out here. Thank you.
Ms. Winch?
Hi, I just wanted to say I would support Josh Levinson's suggestion to keep the tax rate of $650 from the $8 to $10,000 range. Those folks are counting on that money already, and there's no harder time than the present for the most posh folks right now. So I'm still looking forward to voting in favor of this motion altogether, and I hope that we keep that $8 to $10,000 range folks with the $650.
Thank you. Ms. Bowman?
Yes. Sorry, I'm going to try to figure out how to lower my hand while I'm talking. Too much technology. I'm definitely, I am pretty worried about suddenly going backwards on somebody with an $8,000 to $10,000 income and asking them to pay more in taxes that they weren't expecting, even if it does simplify paperwork for them. That could be an impossible proposition for someone on that income base. So I think I'm with Naomi and Josh, and I'm sorry, I should be, I don't know why I've all of a sudden gone informal because we're on Zoom, but at any rate, I'm hoping we can find a way to increase this program, maybe not to the original extent that we thought we would in the beginning, but perhaps doing some step up every year and trying to provide more relief to taxpayers, especially the lowest income that we have, to try to keep people in their houses. I'm aware of all the things that we're juggling. It's really hard to talk about this program separately from the whole budget. So those are just some broad thoughts that when we get to the whole budget discussion, maybe we can bring this back up.
Thank you, Mr. Jankowski.
Thanks. Yeah, I just want to build up on what Mrs. Bowman just said. You know, I think it's important in these times that we be mindful of how we can help you know, our taxpayers, while at the same time making sure we're preserving the educational opportunities for our students, which I think is our primary focus. So, you know, Mr. Saul, if there is a way that we could do this in an incremental basis over a couple of years to what Mrs. Bowman said, I think that might be able to satisfy both ends of the spectrum here, both the taxpayer and the students, rather than, I mean, you know, in a normal year, 74 or 81, depending on where we come with the 8,000 to 10,000 range, isn't an overabundant amount. But this year, I think, you know, $5 is a large amount, considering the economic circumstances. So if there's a way that this could be expanded, you know, incrementally, I don't have suggestions for how to do that, but that might be helpful.
And Dr. Levinson, do you have another comment?
Yes, I do. Thank you. And I appreciate everybody's thoughtful comments on this. I certainly see all sides. Yeah, I will note again, it was the data that Mr. Saul presented in his presentation, you know, was very helpful. And you can look at every $1,000 increment and get an idea of how many people are there. For instance, I don't have it right in front of me, but if you were to go, instead of $25,000, take it to $24,000, that additional, or that $1,000 range actually would pay for, and these estimated numbers pay for that increment that affects those $8,000 to $10,000 range. So I'm not saying that's what we have to do or what we should do, but again, some of the suggestions here is if we can find a way to, you know, increase it incrementally over a few years, you know, I think there would be a way to, again, preserve the position of the lower income earners, but while at the same time capturing a bit more of the population, recognizing that, you know, that you know, participation may or may not, meet the guess is 64%. So, as I said before, I'm grateful for the proposal and also the comments of my colleagues. So, thank you very much.
Seeing no further comments, Mr. Saul, will you continue with your presentation?
Yes, and I just wanted to say thank you for the feedback with regard to this. We will certainly go back and take a look at this and consider this holistically with the entire budget as we move forward. But as I opened with, you know, we did want to deliver something to the board as a starting point for this program. So thank you again for your feedback. Moving on to the proposed final budget. These truly are unprecedented times. In my discussions with my peers across the state, that's probably the underlying conversation, theme of our conversations, is that really we have difficulty finding a benchmark in history that would match this in terms of economics. And so we've spent a lot of time trying to understand the economic impact of what's happening and make the best projections possible that are both conservative yet reasonable in terms of our approach. And in order to provide estimates or the best estimates possible under these circumstances, we've done a number of things, and we will continue to do those things and more if possible. So just to give you some ideas of the things that we've done in developing our projections, we've reviewed the historical data specifically during the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009, and then that period that followed. As we'll talk about a little bit later, some revenues are impacted immediately. Other revenue streams there's a delayed impact. So it's very important to look not only at the time period, but the period that follows. We've discussed our revenue projections with school business officials from our neighboring districts, which have similar, are very similar in many ways while they're different, but regionally you'll have impact will be different. We've talked about the current economic climate with school finance leaders across the Commonwealth. We've participated in statewide forums on school finance matters that have arisen as a result of COVID-19. We've tried to monitor key economic indicators, most especially unemployment, because of the significant changes we've seen there. And then we've participated in financial sector presentations regarding the economic outlook, again, to try to understand what the outlook may be. So then with regard to the budget, given the time constraints for preparing for this evening and making sure the board had the information in enough time to review it and digest it, we reviewed the current year revenue and expenditures as well as the revenue forecast for next year. The proposed final budget does not yet include any expenditure reductions. The administration certainly recognizes the obligation to reduce the expenditures to balance the budget. Although we recognize we need to move swiftly, we certainly want to take a methodical, thoughtful, and deliberate approach to doing this within the very small time frame that we have to do it. So if I can just focus for a minute on the current year revenues and expenditures, which we have looked at and updated, there's a perception that districts have realized significant cost savings in the current year due to the closure of schools. And unfortunately, that perception, it just isn't accurate. As you may recall from other budget presentations, nearly 70% of our budget is salaries and benefits. And when just after schools were closed, you might be aware that the General Assembly passed Act 13 of 2020. Act 13, I'm just going to read a quote from that legislation. No employee of any school entity who was employed as of March 13th, 2020 shall receive more or less compensation than the employee would have otherwise been entitled to receive from the school entity had the pandemic not occurred. And I'll insert there, and schools not have been closed. So really in the category of salary and wages, there is not significant savings. There's a few areas like day-to-day substitutes and overtime. So I don't want to suggest there's no savings, but it is minimal. The remaining 30% of the budget is made up of various fixed and variable costs, such as supplies and capital expenditures, debt payments. There were some expenditure reductions in that category, things like conference travel, supplies, utilities, insurance, pupil transportation. Unfortunately, the reductions we saw there were in many ways offset by the reductions we're seeing in revenues for the current year. And we'll talk about those shortly. If you have your proposed final budget book, you'll recall that in the back, the last page, I always track the changes from one time we review a budget until the next time we review it. You would be able to see there on page 30 that the changes for the current year were a net change of a positive net change of $411,000. The last time we reviewed the current year budget, we were actually still in a negative position. You'll recall that we had a plan of actually spending a little fund balance this year for some projects. And so our current net position is about a positive $90,000. So to reflect back on what I said earlier, there's a perception of significant cost savings. Again, they're just, the cost savings for the current year is not as significant as one may believe it to be. With regard to next year's budget, 2020, 2021, well, that's almost like a tongue twister for me. As I had mentioned, we've looked at the revenue, put together some revenue forecasts. I'd like to note that while the description that I've provided often references an individual point or an individual reference point, maybe the recession of the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009, we've also considered sort of the body of knowledge we've gained from those things I talked about earlier, looking at the financial forecast, talking to others, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot has gone into putting these projections together. So I would like to review the projections for you and talk a little bit about those in the budget, and then I'll have an opportunity for questions after I get through these. Current real estate taxes are made up of two very significant components. Actually, three very significant components. First is your total assessments within your district. The second piece is your millage rate, and the third piece is your collection percentage. You'll recall that previously our millage rate was increased. We were suggesting an increase to the Act 1 index, which was a 3% increase. And we have, in recognition of the economic times, we have reduced that increase from 3% to 1.5%, which has the impact of reducing revenues by 1.34 million. If a question was submitted asking if that was decreased from 1.5% to 0%, what would be the impact? The impact would be an additional 1.46 million. In addition, with regard to the real estate taxes, we have made the adjustment for the property tax rebate program that we just discussed. And then finally, we looked at the real estate tax collection percentage. And interestingly, as you look at that number historically, the variance is very small. Even when we went back to, again, the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009, the drop in the collection percentage was 0.4%, very small. I don't know if that's related to people take their real estate taxes very seriously and they prioritize those over other things. Perhaps it's because many real estate taxes are escrowed into mortgages, and so mortgage companies are ensuring they're paid. But you don't see significant variance in the collection percentage. So we have applied double what we saw in the 2007 to 9 period to 0.8% or 0.8%. I will tell you that other districts in our area have used 1%. I think they primarily used 1% because they use whole numbers in their percentages. So they may have gone from 96 to 95, or 97 to 96. While they maybe are a little more conservative there, I'll point out another area later where I think we're far more conservative. That certainly makes up for that 0.2% on real estate tax. With regard to interim real estate taxes, just as a reminder, interim real estate taxes are taxes levied on projects that are completed between taxing periods. So if you're building a home and it's completed, let's just use January 1st because it's simple. Our real estate tax year runs from July 1 to June 30. So you would then receive an interim tax bill for the additional value on your property from January 1 to June 30. So it's an interim billing. So it's primarily driven by real estate development, adding on to a home, adding on to a commercial building, but building a new commercial building. So when we looked at this item, again, when we did a look back, we saw that the adjustment was, we reduced it by 40%, which was generally in line with what we had seen in the past. You do see some lag in this particular revenue line item because the projects are already, quote, in the pipeline or under construction. So those projects will be completed. So you'll see additional decline in the following year, which we'll see more when we get to our long range plan. But for the 40% really was in line then with what we have seen historically. Earned income taxes are local taxes. They're wage taxes that are generally taken out of an individual's paycheck, remitted to an earned income tax collector, and then they come back to the school district. In 2007 to 2009, they declined by 8%. We have made an adjustment, again, twice that of 16%. And one of the big economic indicators for this particular number would be unemployment. Although you can't, you have to qualify using unemployment. The range that I have seen speculated for unemployment ranges anywhere from 10 to 30%. But what we don't know, nobody will speculate, is how long that is. So if it's 30%, but it's for 6 months, and then it goes down to 5% for the remaining time, you actually then have a blended rate. The other thing that would affect when you look at unemployment is what types of jobs are those people who are unemployed, what kind of jobs do they hold? Are they low-end wage earners or high-end wage earners? Or is it a mix of all of those? Because if you have 20% unemployment, but it's your low-end wage earners, when you look at an income tax, you would actually lose less. If they're your high-end wage earners, you would lose more. So we feel 16% is a conservative number in terms of planning for next year. Just this afternoon, PASBO, the Pennsylvania Association of School Business Officials, released a study that they've done, and they were estimating a range of 15% to 17.5%. So again, I think we're falling right within the range we're seeing there. I can tell you most of our neighbors are using somewhere around 10%. The only percentage I know that I have heard of that's higher is the school district of Lancaster is using 20%, but their earned income tax is a far lower percentage of their budget. And so 20% doesn't have the impact for them that it necessarily does for us. Otherwise, I think you'll find, if you see articles in the newspaper from other districts, that they are going to be estimating a number that's lower than our 16%. Real estate transfer tax, again, as a reminder, that's a tax that is levied on the exchange of real estate. So if you purchase a home from another individual, there's a transaction fee that's collected, and the school district receives a portion of that. Same thing with commercial industrial properties. When we look back, we actually didn't see a huge impact on that particular line item in 2007 to 2009. When we look at our where we are currently, we felt a 10% reduction would be in line with what we've seen, and et cetera. Again, it may be a 10% reduction, but it's a $400,000 actual dollar reduction when you look at it. And then delinquent real estate taxes. We reduced the delinquent real estate taxes by 0.8%. While we have increased, I'm going to try to talk through this. While we've increased the real estate tax delinquency rate, if you will, by reducing our collection percentage, you would anticipate that this line item would increase by a similar amount. Unfortunately, what happens in difficult times is people ask for payment plans or extensions in terms of paying their delinquent tax bills. And so you don't see an immediate impact. It's actually drawn out a little bit. So if you look at the 5-year plan, you actually see it sort of stays down and then picks up in the years out when people are better able to make payments on those plans. For delinquent real estate taxes, there is a small decrease, but a decrease nonetheless. Interest income, over the current year, early in the year, we are enjoying rates of 1.5% to 2.3% on interest investments. Talking or listening and talking to individuals in that line of work, they're saying there's really not going to be interest rate movement probably for a significant amount of time. And so we're looking at actually about a $460,000 reduction in that line item just on rates. The Fed rate, as you know, is almost zero. And so we anticipate, reductions in that area. I want to skip for just a second the state income line items, basic education subsidy and special education subsidy. I'd like to talk about the pupil transportation subsidy. As I've talked about with the board in the past, the subsidy of 1 year is actually driven by your actual expenses in the prior year. So there's a 1-year delay in receiving reimbursement. So the money that we would receive in reimbursement next year will be based on the current year. When we put this together, we believed that the days we would be reimbursed based on the days pupils were transported. We would not be reimbursed based on the days pupils weren't transported. Yet we do have an item on the agenda to consider paying some fixed costs for our contractors, that we wouldn't be reimbursed for those. New guidance came out yesterday or today where PD has said they will consider those additional payments in the reimbursement formula. Again, it's a formula so that we won't necessarily be reimbursed dollar for dollar, but it's positive in as much as there is the potential to receive some additional funds from what we had planned. So this is a line item that we'll have to go back and see if we can figure out how that'll drive through the formula and generate a few extra dollars in that line item. With regard to basic education and special education subsidy, we have had a practice the past few years of budgeting the current year state subsidy held harmless for the following year, primarily because the state budgets are approved in the end of June. We are not necessarily sure whether we'll receive additional funding, if it's driven through the funding formula, how will that affect us, et cetera, et cetera. This is a year where that really benefits us in terms of if the rates are actually held harmless, we haven't planned for additional. And along that line, I wanted to talk about, or with those two items, I should say, I wanted to talk about the federal CARES Act stimulus funding. So the Federal CARES Act established a $13.5 million fund for elementary and secondary schools. Of that, $471 million is coming to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. There are spreadsheets circulating that estimate that East Penn School District will receive approximately $630,000. Those spreadsheets have been put together by various organizations, various legislative caucuses, etc. Unfortunately, that money actually is handed off to the state education, not state education associations, I'm sorry, to PDE, and PDE will then determine how that's distributed. More than likely, it'll actually go beyond PDE and be part of the state General Assembly's appropriations process, which is what happened in 2009 with the federal era American Recovery and Reinvestment Act funds. So in 2009, the General Assembly couldn't afford, if you will, an increase. In fact, they couldn't even afford hold harmless. So they reduced the basic subsidy, but they, quote, backfilled with the federal stimulus money, which then allowed districts or allowed the General Assembly to maintain funding for a 2-year period. When that stimulus went away, so you'll hear often about 2010 and the difficult times that school districts went through in 2010. That's when the stimulus went away. So I have heard a number of times from various sources in Harrisburg that it is very likely that this CARES funding, the federal stimulus money, will become part of the appropriations process. So in the short term, if that's what happens in the short term, we'll likely be made whole in terms of any state funding. We certainly need to be mindful of that should that happen in the long term. So a lot is yet to be seen with regard to that piece, the federal and state piece. And then with the, so I want to just finish up, I guess, by talking about the expenses. Again, as I mentioned, you know, we have not included any revisions to the expense line items in the budget, which you have before you. I wanted to confirm that it also does not include the priority items, which we talked about early in the budget process. The administration will go back. We're going to go through a process of identifying areas to curtail expenses. Those areas would include things like curtailment of building and department budgets, evaluation of all vacancies, evaluation of the contribution to capital reserve, consider refinancing debt, do what they call scoop refunding, and extend the debt a little longer to free up some dollars in the short term. Consider a strategy for effectively using fund balance. Again, I often talk to the board about you need to be very careful about spending fund balance. Fund balance is for a rainy day. If this isn't a rainy day, I'm not sure that I'll ever see one in my career. So I think it would be prudent to use fund balance. I just think we need to be very methodical about the process so we don't dig ourselves into a hole that's very difficult to get out of. So we'll look at all of those types of things, and we will bring a plan back to the board, which should be a holistic plan in terms of how to address the deficit, which is now before us. So with that, I know I certainly didn't cover everything. I'm happy to entertain questions to circle back on anything that I didn't cover.
Ms. Bowman?
Yes, Bob, you did I'm sorry, Mr. Saul, you did a great job. I'm really thankful that you split this up and talked about it in such a way that I think almost anybody could understand, which is quite a feat considering how complex school budgets are. I am wondering if I can ask a favor that's probably not easy, but you went through and gave percentage drops for a lot of these income sources, and in some cases you explained about how much money those would add up to in our budget, but in some cases you didn't say how much money those would add up into our budget. And I was wondering if you could go through each area, if you have it, and just let us know about how much money we're estimating we're going to lose because of these drops in revenues.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. I will tell you also that in the document that's attached to the agenda, which is titled the 2020-2021 Proposed Final Budget, the first item included in there is the overview narrative that I just reviewed for the board. and each of those has the individual amounts listed at the end of each paragraph. So I'm very happy to go through and give those to you. They're also there for your future reference. The total adds up to, I'm just consulting my long-range plan, a little over $6 million. So it's $6,068,000 at the moment.
And that, oops.
Sorry, Ms. Bowman, you're cutting out.
Let's see. Okay, there.
There you
Is
go.
that working now?
Yes.
That's good. Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. Does that include the rebate program that we just talked about, or is that separate from this budget?
No.
That for this, the 6 million.
That does include the rebate program. Yes.
Okay. And then I thought I had one other question about that, but I can't find it. It's okay. Somebody else can go and I'll figure it out.
Are there other questions or comments from the board? Mr. Champagne?
Yes, Bob, thank you so much for the work. And just a couple of quick questions. You went through in the real estate tax area. What is the assumption on assessments? Is that changed because of not being able to get out and do assessments, or are the assessments already in for the coming year?
Yes. Thank you for asking that. The assessments for the real estate tax are based on the report that we received on April 10th. So the 10th day of each month, we receive an updated report. So they are actual assessments. I think what we will see, and you can see this reflected in the long range plan. I know we haven't looked at that yet, but I believe there's a backlog at this point because they're not doing field assessments. Our increase from March until April, in fact, I don't believe there was increase. I think when we got the report, it was the exact same number we had seen the month before. It may have been a very slight increase because of things that they had in process. And typically at this time of year, we start to see those assessments increase. More than maybe we see other times a year. So I believe what will happen is when they cut the file at the end of May for our July 1 billing, it'll have whatever assessments are in there. And then when we look at, for budgetary purposes, we look at our assessments next year, all of a sudden we're going to see an increase of things that were backlogged. So I think there's going to be a slight delay because I think just like many things, they're not making those field assessments. So we're going to see the benefit of that additional growth pushed into next year.
Okay. When you talk about the state revenues, I mean, a couple of things I wasn't around at the time when the last crisis happened and how the state funding went, but I seem to recall there was a pretty sharp reduction, $800 million in the subsidy, basically education subsidy at some point under Governor Corbett. What are you hearing in terms of, I mean, I know that the budget process is, probably been delayed and things. Are you hearing anything about the, significant cuts? You're starting to read, in the papers, states like New York and other, they're going at it pretty hard to whack things out of the budget because there isn't the revenue there. I mean, if we saw a cut similar to what happened in 2008 or 10, whenever it really occurred, I mean, what kind of impact would we find ourselves in? I don't know how much that was to us at that point in time.
Sure. With regard to 2010, I can't comment. I don't know the amount it was then. If if the current scenario played out the way that the 2009 stimulus money was used and it went away, then it would be a $630,000, based on the spreadsheets that are out there, it would be a $630,000 drop off, if you will. Because again, in 2009, the federal era stimulus was used. So the amount that was allocated to each district was the amount that was removed from the state basic education subsidy. And then when in 2010, when Governor Corbett said, look, we don't have the monies, we're not going to backfill that, it was essentially the exact amount of that stimulus funding that went away. So with regard to that part of the question, hopefully I've addressed that. With regard to what's happening with the state budget, the two largest revenue components of the state budget are the personal income tax, which is wage-based, and state sales tax, which you can only imagine what's happening with sales tax at the moment. So I think, I looked at this a week or two ago, I think it's somewhere around 80% of the state's revenues are based off those two revenue sources. And so obviously the state budget is going to have significant problems. And that's why we're hearing that it's quite likely that this federal money could be used to backfill the basic education line item.
Yeah, I know. It just doesn't seem like it's going to help a lot. I mean, it's only like $400 million when we're talking potentially billions of dollars in lost revenue. Okay, thank you very much, Bob. I appreciate it.
Sure.
Dr. Levinson?
Okay, thank you. So I'd like to reiterate that I think you've done a very nice job of laying things out, explaining what the key variables are, particularly with revenues and some known costs, and does give a good picture of the very significant challenge that we have in order to formulate something that's going to be meet our needs and hopefully be fair and representative of what our community is going to be able to afford. I don't necessarily have questions, but I'd just like to call out some things just to make sure that I understand things correctly. You identify that there's a $6 million shortfall, I suppose, between what's been assumed here in terms of revenues and costs. Is that correct?
Yeah, the $6 million shortfall is between the what I'll call the existing expenditure plan that was presented to the board previously, right, and the revised revenue estimates. Okay,
all right. So again, that $6 million. I guess okay. So basically, to make up that $6 million, the hope is to potentially come up with some expense reduction, and perhaps dip into some of that fund balance, all of which needs to be delicately looked at to make sure that we do that smartly. The other thing that's buried in here is moving away from the 3% to the 1.5% property tax increase. Is that? Would you consider the 1.5% to be something that's still potentially variable at this point?
I think that's feedback that we would appreciate from the board. Okay. Let me, if I can just actually make a second statement. I will say that there have now been two, I don't want to call them attempts, there have been two amendments submitted to bills in the General Assembly. I believe both of them were initiated in the House, yeah, to pass legislation to prohibit school districts from increasing their real estate tax for next year. I've heard that the forget the committee right now, but there's again two more bills These are actual bills, I believe, based on that concept that have been introduced today. Again, I think we will continue to see that as a legislative possibility, that we would not be able to increase taxes for next year.
Sure. Yeah, I've taken note of that as well. I also know that there are districts who are at least trying to move the percent increase to as close to zero as possible. Again, trying to be sensitive to that. So that's more of where I'm headed. Not saying we have to have something like that, but I'm just wondering whether there's a possibility to move. And like you say, that's hard to nail down. So I was just wanted to bring that up as a point. Again, I'm grateful for the presentation and appreciate again the methodical way that you present the data. So again, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Jankowski.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks to Mr. Sai again, as with the others. I really appreciate the time and effort you put into this explanation. This was a really easy read, and it really helped with understanding, the different revenue streams. And then, you guys are preempting my legislative update. So I mean, you guys are getting a little bit of taste of it and stealing some of my thunder, but it's relevant. One point I wanted to make was, there's already talk about a fifth phase of emergency legislation that is expected to be presented in Congress around May 5th when Congress comes back into session. And I know there's been a big push from a number of the states, as well as education industry groups in Pennsylvania, to have a significant amount and more flexibility in funding for K through 12. Have you heard of anything? Have you heard of any of this, or are you kind of up to date with what's going on, or what these groups are kind of lobbying for with the Pennsylvania legislators?
I don't know that I can say so much in terms of the General Assembly, Pennsylvania General Assembly. I think the groups, always the education related groups, are always advocating for public education in Pennsylvania. I think the challenge is the state of the Commonwealth budget. I have heard that there are rumblings of potential additional federal stimulus money that could come through. But again, I haven't read that written anywhere. I've just heard it from lobbyists in Harrisburg. So that's all speculation at this point. The CARES funding has been passed, so I can speculate what might happen with that. But in terms of whether we'll see additional revenue sources,
and that's what I was talking about, the federal.
Yeah.
It's being termed COVID-5 now, because this will be the fifth legislation, and there is full expectation that it will come. It's just a matter of what it will include, and it'll be hopefully. I mean, the timing helps with budgeting purposes. I would think if they're looking at beginning of May to get this passed. So I think that hopefully we can hope for the best, that provides some additional relief. Another question I had, and it's really not relevant for this year at this point, but for the long term, again, with respect to assessments, what have we seen in recent years with respect to real estate assessment challenges and appeals, as far as reductions in revenue? And has there been any thought put into an increase in assessment appeals? I mean, I know in 08 and then back even further back in 2001, I mean, that was a means for a lot of commercial properties, mostly commercial properties, trying to ease support their revenue streams by appealing their tax assessments to reduce their burdens and expenses. Did you see anything like that occur in 08 and 09? And is there did that give you any guideposts to what we could be looking at? Or is that number not significant enough to really have that big of an impact?
I'll offer my thoughts on it and give Attorney Fisher a warning that I may ask him, since he was around in 08, 09, what maybe the experience was then, although I can speculate what the experience may have been. Looking forward, I think areas like MacArthur Road and Whitehall Township, where you see a lot of commercial storefront, that I think is going to take a significant hit. I think we know stores like Macy's have been struggling for a long time, and they're in the mall there, and they may not make it through something like this. And I think those places that then become vacant, you will see a lot of assessment challenges. I think the type of commercial industrial we have, which is warehouse, which is really, let's be honest, they're the businesses that are thriving right now to some extent. I think we likely won't see as many challenges from those types of properties as maybe if we were, we had more of the storefront type of properties. And so, Attorney Fisher, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that matter as well.
So you're right, Mr. Saul. Back in 09, we did not see much of any types of tax assessment appeals. I think you've hit it on the head, the type of industry that we have here. And, I think about it, I believe the largest retail operation would probably be Hamilton Crossings, if not, or close to it. And while I haven't looked at that document in a few years, I believe I'm pretty confident in saying that there was a provision written in there that forbade them from seeking an assessment appeal. I believe that's in there as well.
For a period of time.
For a period of time. So I don't think that that's going to be a big concern.
Thanks.
Dr. Munson?
Yeah, thank you. So a comment and then two questions about process. I'm not sure who the best person is to answer those questions. Perhaps Mr. Fisher. The comment has to do with the situation that the budget is in. I appreciate the sort of revision in this proposed final budget from the 3% increase to 1.5% increase. At the same time, when we're looking at an unemployment rate between 10 and 30%, I have a really, really hard time seeing how 1.5% is palatable or manageable for the taxpayers in this community. And so I guess I would echo what I think I heard Dr. Levinson say, that it sure would be good for this community if we could get that down, recognizing that actually puts the whole it moves it from 6.2 million down to 7.7 million dollars. That's the comment. My questions have to do with process. The years that I have been on the board, I have sort of come to recognize the very strict rules that Harrisburg has imposed on us for how we roll out and vote on the budget. And by rules, I guess I mean the timeline. So I'm given all of the uncertainty and problems that we have now, I'm curious what the consequence is if we do not pass a budget by the state mandated time. That's the first question. And then the second question is, even if we did, what are the rules that would allow us to reopen that budget in the coming months as both revenue and income estimates come into greater focus?
So with regard to the second part of the question, the rules to reopen your budget, there is a law that you have 30 days following the passage of the state budget to reopen your budget to make adjustments. if we do not pass a budget, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Attorney Fisher, if we do not pass a budget by June 30th, we cannot make appropriations until a budget is passed. So essentially, we can't spend any money. We couldn't process payroll. We couldn't pay any bills. We cannot appropriate funds until a budget is passed.
Yeah, I agree with that. And as of the moment, the legislature has not changed the timelines for doing what we need to do. And Mr. Saul and I had that conversation last week. As much as it may make sense, perhaps, to delay this process, the legislature, at least as of the moment, hasn't seen fit to change the timeline. So here we are. I mean, one of the difficulties that we have that maybe we can do something with is that, you know, our public meeting schedule is very limited between now and then. We are normally in a position at this phase where the budget that we're looking at now is very similar to the budget we end up voting on in June. But we're now faced with a situation where I think we all agree that the budget that we look at in June will look very different than the budget that we have now. And I just wonder if there's ways that we can build in or scaffold in some additional places so that we don't end up with a you know, a situation where the board is faced with a vote that says you either accept this or we can't process payroll. Which I don't think is I don't think it's a fair position. I don't think that's a useful position for anybody.
If I can comment on process, we have put forth a motion this evening to ask the board to approve the proposed final budget. I did talk with Attorney Fisher about this. There is not a requirement that your proposed final budget look anything like your final budget. Essentially, the requirement of adopting a proposed final budget is a matter of transparency so that you don't walk in, for instance, on June 30th and set forth a budget and approve it. So it prevents a very non-transparent process. The administration is certainly requesting that the board adopt the proposed final budget, which is what we have now, but recognize that you can make any number of revisions between now and adoption of the final budget. There's one that you can make which is really bad form, and I don't believe that we would do that anyway. Once you adopt a proposed final budget, you really shouldn't look at increasing your real estate tax rate or any other tax rates, which again, I don't think we're contemplating. I don't know that it's prohibited legally, but obviously for a number of reasons, it's bad form. But you may recall in the past that we have actually lowered our real estate tax rate between the proposed final budget and the final budget. So from a legal standpoint, there are no restrictions in terms of moving forward. With regard to additional meetings, I leave that up to discussion of the board. I serve at the pleasure of the board, so if there are additional meetings, I will be present.
Okay. I mean, I guess so when, maybe I could ask it this way. When do you anticipate we will see the administration's proposals for cutting what looks right now to be $6.2 million out of the budget? And you know, will there be any time for input from the board on that before we have to vote on that?
Our goal that would be that we would bring you on May 11th at our upcoming meeting, administration's recommendations with regard to what those cuts might be.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Ms. Bowman?
Okay, am I off mute now?
Yes.
Yes, okay, awesome. I remembered what I wanted to ask. So your estimates, you called them conservative. when you say that, are you saying that this might be a worst case scenario, or is it conservative in the sense that it could be even worse than this? Does that question make sense?
Yes, it makes sense. Could they, I guess, here's the challenge, and so I'm not gonna answer your question directly up front. The challenge is we don't know, right? Like right now, your guess is frankly probably almost as good as mine. Maybe mine has a little more research and things behind it, but like anything can happen. If you go back 2 months ago, like we never would have anticipated this, right? So something else could happen to change that. I would like to think that they are, for the most part, a worst case scenario. But having said that, it can always be worse. So I need to qualify that and saying, should we be looking at, could these numbers, could we present a revenue picture that's worse? We could. Do I think this is very reasonable when looking at a conservative a position? Yes. I hope that makes sense.
It does. I was just trying to figure out which way conservative went with
Okay.
exactly what you meant. Yeah. Because it could have meant two different things. And then we had talked before about how our fund balance could have been healthier in comparison to other districts. And so, and while I agree, like if there was ever a time to use one, now would be the time. What is a healthy use of an unhealthy fund balance? The current one brings it down, I think, to 2 million, if I'm remembering correctly, which seems unhealthy, but what would be a healthy use of that?
Yeah, so I haven't spent a lot of time really evaluating, but what I will say is millions is not a healthy use. I mean, we're probably talking something less than $1 million, because you really need to be able to back yourself off of using it. So if you use, for instance, $600,000 this year, you might use $400,000 the following year and $200,000 the following year to sort of back yourself off of the fact that you've built that into your budget. So again, it's really looking at where it is now and some sort of methodical process for getting yourself out of that hole, and not just saying, okay, well, let's use 4 million this year, but then not having a plan for how you make up that 4 million next year.
Okay. And then based on conversations with other business managers and other people in the know, as much as we can predict the future, are we looking at more than just one bad year here, that we might patch a hole this year, but next year could be even worse?
Yeah, so I'll answer it this way. In the long range fiscal and capital plan, I have used a 36-month recovery period for our estimations in the long range plan. When you look at 2000, the Great Recession, it was approximately a 36-month. Although, depending on what economists you listen to, that was, talking economics, that was a U-shaped recovery, and they're talking about something new, which is a Y-shaped recovery, and you can Google that and look what that means. But there's some speculation the recovery could be slightly different. But for our purposes, we've used a 36-month recovery. Okay. I also want to say to your question, that is why it's very important to have a 5-year plan or a long-year plan, a long-term plan, to look at what the future will look like, based on the assumptions we're making for the present.
Okay. And then just finally, I just wanted to mention my thoughts on some of the things that had come up. I agree with other board members that now is not the time to have a tax increase, that we have a huge percentage of people who are out there who are just hurting. And unfortunately, we're coming off of a year where we didn't have an increase, which backs us really far into a hole. And I'd like to preserve as much of the tax relief package as we can within reason. It's hard to say these things without knowing exactly what I think that all adds up to $7.7 million, if I'm correct. Not knowing what that looks like in terms of actual instruction. So I don't know how I vote yes on this when it's not really a budget. It's really just a document that says these are what we think our expenses are. I mean, our revenue is, and we don't know what our expenses are going to be. And I feel like maybe I need more input from that from a legal sense, but I don't feel comfortable casting a vote on this document, even though it is proposed and even though we can change it. But those are my thoughts on, I think I captured all of the items that different board members were offering direction on. So thank you.
Just a comment that maybe we can discuss the proposal when we get to that on the agenda, and ask questions about the material that was presented or make comments about the material that was presented at this point. Mr. Champagne?
Yeah, if Mr. Saul could clarify, maybe Mrs. Campbell, if on the 27th we approve this proposed final budget, walk me through again. I know we've done this before, but when do we have to have all the approvals, and how much latitude do we have in terms of the timing? I know that one of the concerns is printing the tax statements. I knew that was out there, but are we gonna, while you're gonna have updated expenditure numbers at the next meeting, I think we only have one meeting in May, so then we're pushing ourselves out into June before we really have maybe a total picture again. Is there anything in the interim, or are we looking at having to wait that entire month, essentially till we get to the first meeting in June to see the full picture? Obviously, we'll have better information, hopefully, on certain things. But again, I echoing Dr. Munson's concern, I just feel like, we're obviously getting jammed a little bit, not because of our own doing, but because of the circumstances. And I just would like to understand what kind of flexibility we can build into our schedule in order for us to really have a chance to kind of digest things and kick things around, so that we're not put in a situation where we're trying to do things, right up to the deadline.
Mr. Saul, do you want to comment on that?
I was hoping Mrs. Campbell would comment on that.
Well, perhaps I can ask a question along those lines. So this year, because June 1st is a Monday, our second board meeting is on the 22nd. And would that's as long as you can ever have between the second board meeting and the end of the month. Is that long enough to, maybe to cut to the chase to Paul's question, is that long enough to get the tax bills out on time, or is that not a reasonable possibility?
Sorry, I was pulling up my calendar. Was your question if we have the meeting on the 8th, or if we have the meeting on the 20th? If we approved on the 22nd?
I was asking, currently I think the plan is to approve the final budget on the 8th. If we used basically an extra meeting to discuss the budget and approved it on the 22nd, given that that's a little over a week before the end of the month, is that enough time to get if you don't have the answer, that's fine, but is that enough time?
I understand the question. I apologize for that. If we were to approve the budget on the 22nd, it is quite likely that the real estate tax bills will go out late. It takes about 15 calendar days to work through the process of obtaining the data, reviewing the data, sending the bills to sending the data to the printer, having them printed, stuffed, and mailed, etc. So it takes us about 15 calendar days.
And what are the consequences of late mailings? Are there added expenses?
The consequences, the legal consequences are that you need to, so if they are mailed, for instance, 10 days late, you need to extend each of the periods. So you need to extend the discount period. It would, instead of being the end of August, would be, September 10th, et cetera. The practical inconvenience is that a number of our older residents are used to receiving them on the 1st and is very much a habit. And if they don't arrive, we have received numerous comments. Actually, in my first year in 2016, we approved the budget at that second meeting, and it may seem somewhat insignificant, but we received numerous comments or feedback from certain residents.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Champagne, do you have additional questions or comments?
No, other than I guess I will leave it up to the administration to decide how best we can, get the information. But I'm concerned that we're only going to have one meeting between the time we're asked to approve the proposed final budget, see revisions, and then approve a final budget. And I think we need to figure out if we can either get another meeting in there or do something on the back end that obviously, impacts Mr. Saul's discussion. But I just don't think we're going to have the time we need to kind of debate some of the issues that we're going to face when you provide the expenditure reductions.
I just wanted to say as well to the question about the timing, Mr. Saul and I recognized what you, Mr. Champagne, just pointed out in terms of sort of the brevity now, or the speed at which we as a team are going to have to make some really difficult decisions. And so certainly we can take a look at the timing of the meetings, because while we have said that certainly we're committed to bring you some of those proposed cuts to the May 11th meeting, we're going to do our very best job to come as close to that current $6 million deficit that we have as possible. And certainly are going to then be looking for some feedback from the board regarding those proposed cuts that we bring forward. Something that we can also think about, again, with regard to our June meetings, would be maybe we can talk further as a team if we decided to hold the vote on the final budget until the second meeting in June, and then try to do our very best job in terms of communicating with the public in terms of the fact that those tax bills would be potentially a bit later than usual. And I think possibly if we're doing a really great job communicating that, maybe we can alleviate some of the alarm that people would have felt several years ago, just as a way to give us some more time as a team.
Maybe I can propose that we see where we are at the next meeting when we have the list of how onerous the suggested cuts are, to see if we need more time, either through adding additional meeting or pushing out the final approval one meeting. Is there anyone else that hasn't commented the first time? I think Mr. Jankowski already went once, and I just want to make a few comments. I also appreciate the work that the administration has put into updating the finances and outlook amid this unprecedented disruption. I do want to pick up on a couple things that from the back and forth discussion already. I am concerned about hoping we will have additional revenue from a federal stimulus. I think past history tells us that the state is going to reduce the basic education subsidy by dollar for dollar by any additional school money that comes in. And what's potentially worse, it'll leave then a bigger hole in the following years when that subsidy is not there from the federal government. Just in general, I mean, I think we always strive to have the lowest tax increase possible, but I would caution, I guess echoing Mr. Saul's comments about using too much one-time payments, whether it's refinancing to extend maturity dates, using fund balance, whatnot. If it's a one-time income, if we used $2 million this year, then next year we have a $4 million hole that we need to come out of. And so while I recognize the need and the availability to use some of our fund budget to get through this year, I would caution about being very cautious there. And finally, so the bottom line is where we can get on the expenditure reductions. I appreciate the administration coming in with a 1.5% tax increase. I think I'm reading through the lines that's a dollar value that they think that they can get in the neighborhood of. I think that's the number that most people from the public are anxious to see, where, you know, a revision in that number. But the key in my mind is where we can get on the expenses. I mean, obviously we could cover the hole with $6 million from the fund balance this year, but we wouldn't be in awful shape next year. So I would caution if we cannot get there almost entirely on the expense reductions, I would be question how much lower I would be willing to lower the tax rate, given that the impact of programs and the hole we're going to be in next year. So with that, I'll open up to other comments, and I see Mr. Jankowski has his hand up.
Thanks. You know, this is pure speculation at this moment, but I will give you another preview of my legislative update. There is proposed legislation and/or an amendment to existing bills out there that would it would extend the discount period up to 1 month, as well as extend the period for no penalty payment of taxes. So obviously that's still circulating in draft form, but it's something that could be on the horizon in the not too distant future. One thing for consideration is because of, you know, social distancing and all the requirements these days, I've experienced, you know, at my job, severe printer delays because of limited employees and again, trying to meet with social distancing. So while it may have been 15 business days to 18 in the past, I don't know if you've had any discussions, you know, this early in the process with the printers to see if they expect anything or what they can, you know, predict in a couple of months where they might be, and whether that's still a reasonable estimate for the timing to go to print and have the bills ready to circulate. Just some food for thought.
Yeah, thank you for that thought. We actually reached out to the printer to initiate those discussions. We usually try to get started early, and they said, we can schedule for next week because that's when we're starting to bring our staff back. So they're not even operating at the moment. So it's a very relevant point there. With regard, if I can also comment on the plan that's being circulated to extend the discount period. When you consider extension of the discount period, for us, it's not so much the additional discount that would be taken, because if you look at the number of people who pay through during the month of September, it's relatively small. It really becomes a matter of cash flow. And if mortgage companies take advantage of that additional month and pay at the end of September instead of the end of August, ordinarily we get that huge influx of money in at the end of August. It would be the end of September. I actually have taken a look at our current year cash flow and just moved that money we receive at the end of August to the end of September. And fortunately for us, this this year, 2020, October is our 3-pay month instead of September. So we actually would be, we would be able to make it. So if that were something that came to fruition, it should not be problematic unless, for instance, we see the Department of Education defer their June payments or, something that we can't predict. But otherwise, we would be in good shape with that piece. If they did extend the flat rate period or the face period, it's referred to as different things, but if they extended that, it would have the effect of about $140,000 revenue loss for us. Again, that's that 10% penalty that's tacked on during the months of November and December. So one of the proposals is to have a 3-month discount and then a 3-month flat rate, and then it would, when it's turned over for collection, the penalty would be added. So just for the benefit of the board, we have looked at that, and that's sort of where those things stand.
Are there any other questions? Thank you very much, Mr. Saul. We'll move to the next item on the agenda, the district update from Mrs. Campbell.
First and foremost, we certainly hope that our school community is staying healthy and following guidelines for social distancing so that we can all continue to prevent the spread of COVID-19. The physical, social, and emotional health of our students is ultimately what's a priority. And in addition, we're dedicated to continuing to address our students' academic growth through our continuity of learning plan. Our teachers and our administrators district-wide continue to work very hard to identify essential learning goals, to provide instruction, design meaningful learning activities for students, and then also, most importantly, to provide our students with ongoing feedback regarding their progress. And I am pleased that the community has responded very positively to our program so far, as indicated by informal feedback from parents to teachers, from students to teachers, as well as a district-wide participation rate of approximately 90%. So that means about 90% of students district-wide are completing the majority of their online learning activities. Our school teams on a regular basis continue to reach out to those families whose students are not able to consistently participate so that we can determine how we might be able to support these students and the families if necessary. And so for those families that are either tuning in tonight and or those that might watch the recording of the meeting in the future, I continue to encourage any families who might need support to please reach out to your child's teacher or the building principal. We always remind our families that while our buildings are closed, we are all really only an email away. I continue also to encourage families to check our COVID-19 resource page, which is available on the district as well as all of our building websites. And you can find valuable information there regarding our technology support for students, the counseling resources that we have available for students, as well as information about our grab and go lunch program, which, as a reminder, we are offering lunches and breakfast to East Penn students every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 3 locations: Lincoln Elementary, Albertus Elementary, and Lower Macungie Middle School. And I'm happy to report that we've been distributing approximately 1,000 lunches daily district-wide. And I just wanted to take this moment to recognize Paul Velasics and Lauren Havira, who are the supervisors or the director and assistant director of Nutrition Inc. And I also, most importantly, want to recognize our cafeteria employees who have been coming in 3 days a week to prepare as well as distribute those meals. We know that the spring in schools is typically a very busy and exciting time for students as we think about transitioning to new buildings, end of year activities, field trips, graduations, and our teams are continuing to plan for how we can provide these events virtually and or reschedule them for later in the summer when we know that there is a greater likelihood that it's safe for some of those in-person activities to happen. And so certainly at future meetings, we will continue to update the board and the public regarding those decisions that we're making. I'm happy to report that the East Penn Turf Field project will begin on May 5th, which was the date and the timeline that we had originally outlined in our agreement that we have with the contractor. I want to also assure the public that we have all given careful consideration to this project from both a financial and a public health perspective. Specifically, when we consider the project financially, we recognize that there are certain realities. Specifically, we have an agreement. The district has an agreement with LVHN, which includes Lehigh Valley Health Network sponsorship to East Penn for this turf field project. The district also engaged in a contract that we awarded to Skepton Construction to complete the project. In addition, since approving the contract for the project, the products have been ordered and they have been received, and our contractor is ready to go. Some of the public health considerations that we made were that recently Governor Wolf announced that public and private construction may resume in Pennsylvania effective May 1st, 2020, provided that companies adhere to safety guidelines and social distancing protocol as outlined by the CDC and the Department of Health. Skepton Construction, in conjunction with several other health organizations, has developed safety guidelines for its job employees as well as its physical sites. And these guidelines do adhere to the recommendations of the CDC as well as those recently released by the Department of Health. The final piece that I'll mention is that the turf field project is one that's an outdoor project and naturally lends itself to social distancing. For example, on average, we'll have 10 or fewer construction employees who will typically be on the job site at any one time. So I share that with the board and the community in terms of you can certainly expect to see some action happening on the turf field beginning May 5th. I'd also like to take a few moments just to recognize some of the outstanding accomplishments of our students and staff. During the months earlier this year of January and February, our students at Macungie Elementary did a phenomenal job in terms of supporting St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital through participation in their annual math-a-thon. The students solved math problems and asked friends and family members for donations to sponsor them in their work. And the students raised $10,000 this year, which is the largest amount that Macungie Elementary students have raised since they began participating in this particular event in 2007. And I'm also happy to report that our Macungie Elementary students, in participation of the St. Jude's Math-a-thon, have raised a total of $50,000 since they have begun to complete this contest. I also want to congratulate our Emmaus High School orchestra students who qualified and participated in the PMEA Regional Orchestra Festival, which was held on March 12th. Specifically, the three students who participated are Matt Sipix, Nat Wirtz, and Nick Cannon. Also during the month of March, we had students from our high school as well as our middle schools who participated in History Day competitions. Typically, the competitions would be held, the high school competition would typically be held at Muhlenberg College, but this year, like many situations this spring, the History Day competition was held virtually. And so we have 23 Emmaus High School students who qualified at the regional level competition to now move on to the state competition for the high school. At Lower Macungie Middle School, we have 5 students who will be advancing on from the regional competition to the state level competition. East Penn was recently given another recognition, this time for its outstanding work in the musical performances. Specifically, East Penn was recognized by the NAM Foundation, the National Association of Music, And we were recognized as a 2020 Best Community for Music Education District. So certainly I wanted to take an opportunity to recognize our music teachers district-wide who do a phenomenal job of making music an integral part of our students' education. Also, congratulations to Denise Riemann, who's a high school teacher, and she was recognized as the 2020 Pennsylvania Journalism Teacher of the Year. Tim O'Connor, who is a teacher at our high school and also one of our coaches, was named as the Morning Call Swim Dive Coach of the Year. And Brendan McCourt, who's a high school student, he also visited our board meeting. He was named the Morning Call Swimmer Diver of the Year. You may have noticed on Friday, April 17th, our Emmaus High School Stadium, along with other Lehigh Valley High School stadiums, was lit up to honor the class of 2020, our healthcare professionals, as well as all essential employees who are out there on the front lines to get us through this pandemic. Speaking of our seniors, we're making sure that our seniors shine again this year through the 2020 Grad Spotlight campaign. Hopefully you've been noticing the Grad Spotlight and continuing to share those great accomplishments through social media. Finally, during the pandemic, I wanted to recognize some students and community members who continue to really go out of their way to make us East Penn proud. Our Emmaus High School students, teachers, and parents donated supplies to make over 100 masks for local healthcare workers. A special thank you goes out to the EHS Red Cross Club, Jordan Howard, as well as Kakoli Carr. Our Albertus elementary students in first grade, they were learning about community helpers and social studies. And so they expressed their gratitude to community helpers by writing thank you letters to local doctors. Our EHS Interact Club, we have two students, Sam and Grace Comfort, who made signs to thank and encourage healthcare workers from Lehigh Valley Health Network. And these signs are displayed at the hospital entrance to greet our community heroes each day. We have a 9th grade student, David Hunsaker from Emmaus High School. He made over 100 masks for local firefighters. And I'm also happy to point out the Emmaus Rotary, in collaboration with other community service organizations, continues to donate non-perishable groceries to East Penn families. And each week we're able to support approximately 200 families district-wide with those groceries. And finally, our Angel Network from our schools collected $7,500 worth of grocery gift cards. And these gift cards were then sent to over 120 families district-wide to support our families in need. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Campbell. Are there any questions or comments from the board? Okay, then moving on to the proposed final budget and senior citizens real estate's tax rebate program. May I have a motion?
Paul Champagne, so moved.
Josh Levinson, second.
Okay, discussion. I know we had a bit of discussion and questions on the proposal, but now that we're talking to the actual motion, are there any additional comments? Dr. Levinson?
Yeah, I'm just going to say that, you know, I understand this, the need to vote for this tonight is mainly procedural. I understand that we have a pretty tough hill to climb to get some realistic proposals to close that gap that we mentioned. So, you know, voting in favor of this is voting in favor of, you know, continuing that process so that we can get there by the end of June and get something that meets our needs. So that's where I stand. Thank you.
Any other comments? I will echo Dr. Levinson's remarks. This is clearly a work in progress, needed to meet a state timeline requirement. Clearly, many of us wouldn't be comfortable with a $6 million budget shortfall, structural gap, but I will be supporting this as part of moving the process forward. Ms. Bowman.
Maybe I'm just, this is going to be a statement that's more of a question, I suppose, but maybe I'm confused about why we need to vote tonight on this at all, because I feel like I'm voting on a question mark. Like there's no piece of this that is actually, I feel like I'm voting on a document that's full of numbers that we think are going to change. We don't know what the tax increase will be, whether it's 0 or 1.5%. We don't know what the cuts will be and how steep the cuts will be and how much is coming out of the fund balance and how much isn't. And I just don't understand exactly what it is that I'm being asked to vote on, other than this is the current state of what we think our financial picture looks like. And maybe that could be answered for me, but right now I don't feel comfortable voting on this.
I would say that what you surmised is my opinion of what we're voting on. I expect the details to change. I think the administration has, given what we know now, has taken a shot of what the tax increase might be. I think Mr. Saul said it's their intention that it will be either 1.5% or lower. We have a requirement to pass this budget, this proposed preliminary budget, a certain number of days before we can pass the final and publish it before we can pass a final budget. So I think that's what's pushing this timeline forward. I don't know if Mr. Fisher or Mr. Saul can comment on the timing, but that's my understanding of why we're doing it now.
Yes, that's accurate. There 30 days, 30 calendar days must elapse between the adoption of the proposed final budget and the actual adoption of the final budget. And as the timeline currently stands, there's not 30 days between the May board meeting and the June 1st board meeting in June. I think under normal circumstances, we as the administration would never put this before the board in its current form, but these certainly aren't normal times. And so we almost felt compelled to put it before the board to meet those timeline requirements in line with Dr. Levinson and Dr. Bacher, their sentiments in terms of moving this forward. And Attorney Fisher, I don't know, I mean, we've talked about this. I don't know if you have anything you care to add about the process.
There really is nothing I can add about the process. The timeline is the timeline. This cannot be your final budget. It cannot be your final budget you adopt, because there's $6 million missing right now that has to be accounted for. However, I think I heard the word used, maybe it was by Mr. Saul before, this is a placeholder. There's also nothing illegal about adopting a proposed final budget that has a structural deficit of anything in there. Historically, while your proposed final budgets have come very close to your actual final budgets you've adopted, they've always changed, I will say, to some extent or in some extent. This is just going to change more. So it is a legal requirement to meet the timeline, and with the timeline the administration set forth, I would recommend that the board consider adoption of a proposed final budget this evening.
Mr. Champagne?
Yes, I would just like to make sure that the public understands the process, and I think Mr. Fisher and Mr. Saul have done well in explaining, that this is obviously something we have to do from a legal standpoint in order to make the timeline that we are, under, but recognizing, and I think hopefully the public will recognize, and others out there, other stakeholders, that we are striving to close this gap that we have identified, and that in the upcoming meetings, you will be seeing, the public will be seeing additional information to help do so. So while supporting this may not be what we all want to do, I think it's helpful to Mr. Saul and to the district to get this budget approved, recognizing that we are going through a significant number of changes in the upcoming meetings. Thank you.
Are there any comments? Any additional comments or questions? Mrs. Allen, will you call the roll?
Mr. Jankowski,
Aye.
Dr. Levinson,
Aye.
Dr. Munson,
Aye.
Mr. Smith,
Aye.
Ms. Lynch,
Aye.
Ms. Baumann,
No.
Mr. Byrd,
Aye.
Mr. Champagne,
Aye.
Dr. Butter.
Aye.
8 ayes, 1 nay.
Motion passes. Moving on to personnel items. May I have a motion for items 1 through 13?
Jeff Jankowski, so
Elisa Bowman, second.
Are there any comments or questions from the board? I know Mrs. Campbell had some comments she wanted to make on the personnel items.
Yeah, I just wanted to take a moment to comment that, as you can see, as part of the personnel items, the board is accepting the retirement of several East Penn employees. And I just wanted to say that we certainly appreciate the service and dedication of all of these individuals that they have demonstrated over many, many years to the students of East Penn. And in particular, one of the retirements is for Mrs. Susan Arnold, who has been a teacher for 39 years. And for many of those years, she has served as the president of our East Penn Education Association. And in my tenure as superintendent, as well as in my former role as assistant superintendent, I had the opportunity to work with Susan on a variety of projects, and have always appreciated her leadership, really her openness to work through situations, ultimately, truly in the best interest of our educational community. So thank you.
I'd also like to echo Mrs. Campbell's comments on Ms. Arnold. I have known of her for quite a while. I know she was quite instrumental in working with the board in the last major fiscal issue we went through that's been referred to several times already in the 2009 to 2011 timeframe. I just recently have worked with her on the last teacher's contract, and I think she was a very good negotiating partner, and I think we came up with a contract in the best interest of the district and the teachers, and I think she was a very good leader, and I hope the incoming president of the teachers union will have a similar good relationship with the district. Thank you. Are there any other comments? Ms. Allen, will you call the roll, please?
Dr. Levinson,
Aye.
Dr. Munson,
Aye.
Mr. Smith,
Aye.
Ms. Lynch,
Aye.
Ms. Bowman,
Aye.
Mr. Byrd,
Aye.
Mr. Champagne,
Aye.
Mr. Jankowski, Can
Could you repeat that, Mr.
Mr.
Jankowski?
Aye.
Got it. Thank you. Dr. Bacher,
Aye.
9 ayes.
Motion passes. Moving on to business operations. If there's no objection, I'd like to entertain a motion for A through E and G taken together. So everything but the contracts and agreements.
Paul Champagne, so moved.
Ziad Munson, second.
Is there any discussion? Mrs. Allen, will you please call the roll?
Dr. Munson,
Aye.
Mr. Smith,
Aye.
Ms. Lynch,
Aye.
Ms. Baumann,
Aye.
Mr. Byrd,
Aye.
Mr. Champagne,
Aye.
Mr. Jankowski,
Aye.
Dr. Levinson,
Aye.
Dr. Bacher.
Aye.
9 ayes.
Motion's passed. I'll now entertain a motion for the contracts taken together. Item F.
Adam Smith, so moved.
Josh Levinson, second.
Any comments or questions? I'd like to just make one comment on the STA renegotiated agreement. It lists the cost of a bit over $1 million, but there's also $1 million of savings in this. So I appreciate the hard work from the business office renegotiating that contract and having one less $1 million of hole to dig out of. Any other comments or questions? Mrs. Allen, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Smith,
Aye.
Ms. Lynch,
Aye.
Ms. Baumann,
Aye.
Mr. Byrd,
Aye.
Mr. Champagne,
Aye.
Mr. Jankowski,
Aye.
Dr. Levinson,
Aye.
Dr. Munson,
Aye.
Dr. Bacher.
Aye.
9 ayes.
Motion passes. Moving on to curriculum. May I have a motion for the suspension of graduation requirements resolution?
Adam Smith, so moved.
Elisa Baumann, second.
Is there any discussion? Mr. Champagne?
No, I didn't have any comment. It was inadvertent.
Okay. No additional comments or questions. Mrs. Allen, will you call the roll, please?
Ms. Lynch,
Aye.
Ms. Baumann,
Aye.
Mr. Byrd,
Aye.
Mr. Champagne,
Aye.
Mr. Jankowski,
Aye.
Dr. Levinson,
Aye.
Dr. Munson,
Aye.
Mr. Smith,
Aye.
Dr. Bacher.
Aye.
9 ayes.
Motion passes. Moving on to policy. We have first reading of several policies. Mrs. Campbell, do you and or Mr. Provolitis have some opening remarks?
Yes, I am going to ask Mr. Povolitis to give a brief overview of the policies that we're proposing tonight for first reading. I also just wanted to bring to the public's attention that there were several policies that we had already begun in terms of looking at those policies. And so we have temporarily suspended that particular series of policies because there are other policies that warrant our immediate attention so that we can have these policies reviewed and approved and in place in East Penn by July 1st. Specifically, Mr. Povolitis will talk about the information regarding compulsory school age. So again, I just wanted to be transparent with the public in terms of we have intentionally made a decision to put a series of policies on hold for now, but we will certainly then bring them back to the board after we work through this next round of policies.
Okay, good evening. So as Mrs. Campbell mentioned, we're putting a few policies on hold just because of the cancellation of the last meeting. And so with that, we are recommending moving forward with 3 policies and the first reading of those policies. And I'll go through each one and then of course take any questions. So the first policy that we're recommending is 006.1, attendance at meetings via electronic communications. This policy was updated as a result of COVID-19 pandemic to reflect the potential impact of extenuating circumstances such as health, safety, emergencies, and of course, the state that we're in right now. Essentially what this will do is school boards may conduct meetings entirely via electronic communications, provided that such meetings maintain compliance with public access and comment requirements of the Sunshine Act. We are recommending that that policy be approved at the next meeting with only 2 readings, but of course that's up to the board to decide. Since 006.1 was suspended at the beginning of tonight's meeting, that's really a board decision, but of course we can move forward and we can approve that in just 2 readings. The next 2 meetings are coming forward because of compulsory school age. And the reason that we're moving these forward is because we want to make sure that they get approved before July 1st. If you recall, a few months ago, we did discuss and the board did approve several policies that dealt with compulsory school age, but we held on attendance and suspension and expulsion because it clearly laid out the age, the compulsory school age, which beginning with 2020-2021 school year will now be defined from age no later than age 6 until the student reaches 18 years of age. So with the clear definition in these 2 policies, we waited until as late as possible to pass them so that they'll be in place for July 1, but they weren't in place prior to that. And so we want to update those policies based on Act 16 of 2019. And so both of those policies, as I stated before, are specific to compulsory school age, and that's the rationale for the recommendation that we bring them forward. And for 3 readings as we typically do. I'm happy to take any questions. I saw Dr. Bacher is muted.
Sorry, yes, I was muted. Are there any questions? I see Mr. Jankowski.
Yep. Of course, it's a policy, so I'm going to have comments. So thanks for your work on these again, Mr. Povolitis. So I've got 3 questions throughout this policy. The first is under authority. So the second paragraph talks about how a school director can attend via electronic communications only under extraordinary circumstances, but other necessary participants may participate via electronic communications as the board president deems appropriate. Was that distinction intentional with a higher threshold for board members than necessary participants? Because it would seem that anyone who is, if you're a necessary participant, I'm afraid of setting precedent and using, anytime someone asks, extraordinary circumstances is extraordinary circumstances. So that kind of sets the bar pretty high and kind of gives you an idea of what what you need in order to do so. And it seems like there should be some type of guidance with respect to necessary participants.
Yeah, I believe that it is specific to a certain threshold because the role of the board members and others that play a critical role in meeting the legal obligations of the meeting. And so I do believe that that's the case for the language.
Do we want some type of a standard or guidance for other participants so that not that I would expect it would become an issue, of course, but just some reasonableness or there's extenuating circumstances or something that controls that, just so that we kind of keep this tight. Obviously, the preferences that were everyone's in person.
That's absolutely something that the board can consider if we want to look at that. I know that we always want the public to be able to attend, with minimal, obstacles, but whatever the board recommends.
I mean, it seems like it goes beyond. It's not the public per se. What is a necessary participant? I mean, is that someone who has an integral role in that meeting, or? I think the public we have our own standards for the public, obviously, but my understanding of this was that it's someone who actually is participating during the process, during the meeting.
For example,
Right.
Mr. Saul giving a budget presentation.
Right.
Yeah.
Or
exactly.
me.
Or you.
Or me.
you.
Right? Yeah. Exactly. Sure.
Yes.
So perhaps if we added the language, just putting in extenuating circumstances, so participating in meetings via electronic communications under extenuating circumstances as deemed appropriate by the board president. My guess is it's usually not a case that we could have a public vote on this, because it would tend to happen in between meetings. So I'd be fine adding additional language there and giving clear authority of who can deem it appropriate.
Okay.
Good.
Thank you.
No, I think that sounds good. And then under guidelines, the first paragraph and then the third paragraph, which is the top of page 2, do we also want that to apply to necessary participants? Because I would think, if you attend the meeting through electronic communications, there should be criteria that you have to meet in order to be deemed present. And I think those would also apply. The same criteria that applies to the directors here should also apply to necessary participants due to the fact that they are necessary participants.
Okay.
So I think in the first paragraph and then the third paragraph, the same thing. If there should be a process by which you have to, you should have to request far enough in advance the ability to participate via electronic communication. And I think these three criteria, or compliance criteria, should also apply to anyone else who is participating electronically.
The only caveat I would add to that is I believe the guidelines for the board are set forth in state law, that we have to be able to see all the information and hear all the information for the whole meeting to be deemed present. There could be a situation where someone has extenuating circumstances that they can only attend a certain part of the meeting that they're necessary for, and I think that would be acceptable so I would make that distinction.
Yeah, I agree with that. Even the participating in the entire board meeting. Yeah, I think that I would agree with that.
Are there further questions?
That's all I have on those.
Are there any other board questions on this policy or the other two? Mr. Champagne.
Yes, I did have a question on the next policy under let's say delegation of responsibility on page 4 of 8. item number 4, it says clarify the district's responsibility for collaboration with non-public schools in the enforcement of compulsory school attendance requirement. When we say non-public schools, I assume that excludes charters. Do we have to also include charter schools as part of school attendance requirements under this policy? Or why are we excluding? Maybe the question is, why are we excluding charter schools?
Mr. Fisher, do you have a comment on that one?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. I will review the language, but I will remind you, I think you accurately stated a charter school is a public school. So that is the distinction. So let me take a look at that language. We'll get back.
I think Paul's question was, if there are public schools, do we have no requirements to force the attendance at charter schools, or is that part of their charter that they have to do it themselves?
We do have some oversight and responsibilities, and there's some accountability issues they have with respect to us that are typically handled under the charter itself. But we'll take a look at that, Paul.
To see if we need to add something here. Thank you. Are there any other comments or questions on these policies? Then we'll move forward to other educational entities. Ms. Bowman, do you have an update for the CLIU?
Yes. So our last meeting was also a virtual meeting, and a lot of it was updates about all of the steps the IU is taking to try to offer educational programming for special education students in a way that they can access it. And that has been necessitating some around the clock work from the IU to make that happen, rewriting policies, trying to find ways to remain in compliance, working with the state and things like that. Beyond that, we approved a lease agreement for the carbon part of the intermediate unit, and adopted their calendar for next year, such as it is. I don't know how much it's going to actually apply, but that sums up the whole meeting.
Thank you. Are there any comments or questions from the board? Then moving forward to approval of the CLIU facilities plan. May I have a motion?
Paul Champagne, so moved.
Second, Elisa Bowman.
Second.
Is there any comments or questions on this proposal, on this motion? Mrs. Allen, will you call the roll, please?
Mrs. Bowman?
Yes.
Mr. Byrd?
Aye.
I'm sorry, say it again.
Aye.
Thank you. Ms. Champagne?
Aye.
Mr. Jankowski?
Aye.
Dr. Levinson?
Aye.
Dr. Munson?
Aye.
Mr. Smith?
Aye.
Ms. Lynch?
Aye.
Dr. Bacher?
Aye.
9 ayes.
Motion passes. Moving on to the LCTI update. Mr. Champagne, do you have an update?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Dr. Bacher. There were 2 virtual meetings held of the Joint Operating Committee. The first one was on March 25th. The second last week, April 22nd. Highlights from those meetings are as follows. First, I'd want to congratulate the LCTI team for their ability to make a sizable donation of PPE to the local healthcare organizations. They donated over 8,000 N95 respirators, over 1,700 pairs of safety glasses, and 4,000 pairs of surgical gloves. Most of this equipment was given to LCTI at the time of the distribution center instructional program got underway. According to Dr. Rushton, when they made the donation to Fellowship Community and Manor Care, which are some long-term care facilities, they were down to their last N95 masks. So a great job by the LCTI administrative team to make that donation. The JOC last week unanimously approved a revised 2021 budget for LCTI, which essentially zeroes out the proposed increase in sending district contributions for the upcoming fiscal year. This revision will refund approximately $750,000 to the sending districts. East Penn's contribution will be about $65,000 in savings. And there is a presentation included in the agenda tonight on that revised budget. That was unanimously approved by the JOC. On continuity of education, remote instruction started on April 6th, but lack of devices prevented some of the students from online learning. Subsequent to that, LCTI has been able to distribute over 600 LCTI Chromebooks to the Allentown School District students who attend LCTI. The distribution was to take place on April 24th for the Deeroff students and April 27th for the Allen students. The last meeting, we also honored the outstanding co-op students for the year. 2 East Penn students were recognized in the area of auto technology. Jeffrey Confer, who worked at Bennett Toyota, and Dominic Storm, who worked at Scott Chevrolet. Then the senior award ceremony that was scheduled for May 28 at the PPL Center has been canceled, obviously because of the current crisis, but we are working on developing a virtual recognition event to honor those the graduating class. And unfortunately, Camp LCTI, which is a great event, has also been canceled for this summer. That is my report. Any of the other JOC members have anything to add, please do so.
Are there any questions for Mr. Champagne? Dr. Levinson?
Yeah, again, that was a great report, Mr. Champagne. I just wanted to echo a comment that I made last week during the JOC meeting, just how grateful our district and the other sending districts are to LCTI for making the adjustments to next year's budgetary payments that we do for them. It should be emphasized that LCTI did this proactively, not at the request of the districts. And for me, I think that's very impressive for this entity to do that, and it really does emphasize the fact that they're an educational and an operational partner in what it is that we deliver. So I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you. Are there any other comments or questions on the report?
Dr. Bacher, this is Mr. Saul, if I may. We absolutely do appreciate the adjustments LCTI made. I do want to caution the board, however, the way it was structured, we just need to be careful because they structured it as a rebate, a one-time rebate, not a reduction, not a lowering of their tuition for next year. So the following year, the rebate goes away, but yet the tuition, I imagine, will go up. So we need to be cognizant of that and how we budget, because again, it creates one of those mini cliffs for us. So we are very, very appreciative, but yet need to be mindful of the way it was structured.
Thank you. Any other comments before we move on? Okay, moving on to legislative report. Mr. Jankowski, you have some, you saved some good nuggets for your report?
I don't know if they're good nuggets, but they're nuggets. So there's been a lot of action in both the state and the federal, Congress and legislature. Obviously, everyone's aware of Act 13, which Mr. Saul mentioned, which extended the or closed schools for the rest of the school year. waived the 180-day instructional day requirement, mandated that employees get paid through the shutdown, as well as receive retirement credit for those eligible. Both the House and Senate have revised their schedules, and they are both in session this week. The House for 3 days and the Senate for 2 days. Some of the legislation that's being bandied around there. One piece, as Mr. Saul referred to earlier, there was an amendment to an existing bill that was discussed that would have frozen school property tax rates for 2021. And the leadership of that amendment could not garner sufficient votes, so the amendment was withdrawn. However, this week, the House State Government Committee is posting 2 bills that also include a provision to freeze school property tax rates for 2021. One of those bills, House Bill 1776, is also co-sponsored by the sponsor of the amendment that was shut down, and apparently he's pretty angry and really is pushing to get that through. Those bills, in addition to a tax freeze, would also add some additional provisions that would allow districts to open their 1920 budget to make adjustments for savings or additional expenses as a result of school closures. And the purpose behind that bill is that there's still many lawmakers that believe that school closures are actually saving school districts money. So there's this misperception out there that they still can't seem to get over. And there's still a support for this tax freeze proposal. Over this past weekend, the Pennsylvania Association of School Administrators, several education associations, and labor groups sent a letter to the House State Government Committee in opposition of these bills. So there is a lobbying effort going on, in support of schools to block their passage. But there is still a belief, though, that one or both have a good likelihood of being approved along party lines. So we'll see what happens there. And then, as we mentioned earlier, there's also being circulated by several House members as an alternative to the tax freeze, legislation that would extend by 1 month the discount period for paying school taxes, and extending the face value period to December 31st. So again, that's all in early stages, and we'll see what happens there. In addition, some other bills that are currently in committees are one titled the Hunter Education Classes. So this was a House bill that was approved by the House, and it's currently in the Senate Appropriations Committee. This bill would require every school district to make available to the Pennsylvania Game Commission at no charge a classroom or instructional facility at which hunter education classes could be conducted if requested by the Game Commission. And it would be either after school, evening, or weekend classes taught by Game Commission certified instructors and made available to the public as a community service. So that passed the House, and it's currently in committee in the Senate. There's another bill that recently passed the Senate and is currently in House committee. It's a bill that removes outdated provisions and mandates from the school code. It's basically just a cleanup bill that doesn't have any real impact going forward. It's just outdated provisions that they're trying to clean up. And then one final bill, which is currently, it's a Senate bill that's in the Senate Appropriations Committee, called the Sexual Assault in Schools. This bill would require a student who is convicted or adjudicated delinquent of sexual assault to be expelled or transferred to another building or transferred to another program apart from the victim if enrolled in the same K through 12 school district. And parents or guardians who register their student in a school district would be required to confirm whether the student previously or currently is expelled for this offense and provide information relative to the name of the school and term of expulsion. on the federal side of things, you know, we've already, there's been plenty of discussion about the CARES Act and the funding and what the belief is and how that funding will get to the school districts. As I mentioned earlier, there will be a fifth funding bill. It's widely believed that will also, you know, should pass pretty overwhelming support in both chambers of Congress. It would not, Congress is not back in session until May 8th when it is expected for this bill to be presented. It's still, there's not much clarity on what the funding would be for, but there is a big lobbying effort out there urging at least the Pennsylvania congressional delegation to support significant flexible funding for K through 12 education in order to try to fill some of these gaps that school districts are experiencing. So obviously, you know, there is support out there for the schools, and there is understanding, at least on the ground, as to, you know, the impact that this shutdown and economic environment is having. It's just a matter, and it seems like for once the federal Congress gets it and they're trying to do their part, we just need to get the state on board, and that seems to be where there's a lot of just a lot of education needed on the state side.
Thank you, Mr. Jankowski. Are there any comments or questions for the legislative report? Then moving on to report on Future Ready Advisory Board. Mr. Smith?
Thank you, Dr. Bucker. I'm excited to have my first report on some of the work that we've been doing. Since this is my first report, just a quick reminder for those who may not be aware, Future Ready is a nonprofit education policy and advocacy organization based out of Washington, D.C. I was able to connect with several team members and have a little bit more specific knowledge about what the makeup of the team is for the advisory board. I'm one of 3 school directors, as I mentioned earlier. There's also 5 superintendents or county system leaders, and also the policy director for the National School Boards Association was able to join us as well in some of our work. So the first major project that we undertook was the development of the school board strand, where we discussed a draft proposal and provided some feedback around 6 strands. And they are curriculum instruction and assessment, personalized professional learning, robust infrastructure, budget and resources, community partnerships, and data and privacy. And so I'm happy to report that after the feedback and discussion that we had, I'm able to share with you the final version of the school board strand framework that was attached to the agenda and shared with you for tonight. The framework mirrors everything we currently have in place in East Penn, and also reflects the vision for where we want to go as a district. It will be invaluable for establishing goals and defining next steps, not only for us here in East Penn, but for districts nationwide. The other interesting experience I was able to have was through a conversation. Well, let me back up a minute. I guess I could say that the development of the school board strand, that was kind of some of the expected work that I was undertaking. Some of the unexpected work centered around the unexpectedness of the last 2 months. So they were interested in hearing more about how students or how districts are providing equitable access to learning opportunities remotely. And so they had asked for an interview with me to talk about what we as a board are doing. And so that that interview is still being processed right now. They're putting it together now, and it should be on a blog post that'll be appearing on their website, futureready.org, in the coming days. We had a really interesting conversation, and that the woman that I was speaking to was actually based out of a county level system in Fairfax, Virginia, and talked about some of the struggles that they're having down there. A lot of it centered around technology issues and things not working the way they're supposed to. Certainly, while we're all kind of familiar with that a little bit, I think on our end, they were having some pretty critical challenges that were impeding learning for students on a very county-wide level down there. So in terms of my conversation, I was able to speak to what we are doing here in East Penn in terms of providing equitable access for all students to a virtual learning environment that included our continuity of learning plans, which I explained that it was a statewide kind of a setup that was put in place, but I talked about how we had our 3 phases of learning here. I also talked a little bit about our discussions to provide virtual meetings that give the public voice and access to the meetings like we are having tonight. And then the critical conversation that we're having now about budgeting for an uncertain future. I think that's something that is certainly facing a lot of boards, a lot of districts across the country. So I think the challenging conversations that we're having right now are certainly, we are not alone in having that, not even in our little corner of Pennsylvania. So it was an interesting conversation, and I'm looking forward to seeing what they put together. When that comes out, I'll share with everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith, and do send us an email when the interview is posted on the website. Are there any comments or questions from the other board members on Mr. Smith's report? Then moving forward to other items, may I have a motion for resolution supporting charter school funding reform?
Ziad Munson, so moved.
Adam Smith, second.
Is there any discussion? I just like to comment, this is an area, something within the purview of the state government, state legislature to accomplish. I think it's needed reform, and I think it's an area where they could lower costs to school districts without impacting their budget negatively. So if we pass it, I assume there's be broad support for this. I will share it, we'll share it with our local legislatures. Are there any other comments? Mrs. Allen, will you call the roll, please?
Ms. Bowman?
Aye.
Mr. Byrd?
Aye.
Mr. Champagne?
Aye.
Mr. Jankowski?
Aye.
Dr. Levinson?
Aye.
Dr. Munson?
Aye.
Mr. Smith?
Aye.
Ms. Lynch?
Aye.
Dr. Bacher?
Aye.
9 ayes.
Motion passes. Moving on to announcements. We did not have an executive session before this meeting, but we had executive sessions on March 23rd and April 13th, where we discussed litigation, negotiations, and personnel. Our next regularly scheduled board meeting will be on Monday, May 11th at 7:30 p.m. I fully expect that to be another virtual board meeting. I will now entertain a motion to adjourn.
Adam Smith, so moved.
Ziad Munson, second.
Mrs. Allen, will you call the roll?
Yes. Mr. Byrd?
Aye.
Mr. Champagne?
Aye.
Mr. Jankowski?
Aye.
Dr. Levinson?
Aye.
Dr. Munson?
Aye.
Mr. Smith?
Aye.
Ms. Lynch?
Aye.
Ms. Bowman?
Yes.
Dr. Bacher?
Aye.
9 ayes.
Thank you very much. The meeting is now adjourned.